Or to the cloud. Okay, right. I don't know, you should have received some kind of a warning, everyone who's just joined or who's just joined previously. Yeah, so it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Edwin Burns, who is a senior lecturer at Edge Hill University. And we've met a couple times at conferences, and I mean, he's working in a very close area, you know, to the work that we do, like face processing, but focusing more, as he will be talking about today, on people at the low performing end of the probable ability spectrum, that is face identity processing. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to your talk, which I understand is now also a published paper. So just, you know, shameless plug for your paper here at the beginning of the
Thank
talk.
you.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this talk today. I realize 4 days before Christmas is maybe quite a busy time, especially for those of us that leave buying presents to the last minute. As Mika pointed out, the talk today is a paper that's already published. I think it came out 2 weeks ago in Behavioral Research Methods. I'm going to cover some of the main points that I cover in the paper today in this talk, but there is a lot of more points that I make in the paper. So if you do want to have a bit more detail, I'd recommend you go and read up on it. To give you a little bit of background, I suspect everyone here probably knows this already, but developmental prosopagnosia is a lifelong condition characterized by severe difficulties in recognizing faces. So people with this condition will tell you that when they're reporting the symptoms that characterize this condition, they'll be telling you that, you know, they're not recognizing people that they know in the world around them, and this can be neighbors, it can be work colleagues, it can be even close friends, and sometimes close family members. One of the first cases that I tested was a woman in, I think, her late 30s, 10 years ago when I started my PhD, and she was telling me that she couldn't recognize her child quite often when she was going to pick her up from school. Now, I don't think anyone would consider that a sort of behavior that we see in the general population, and this sort of illustrates some of the difficulties that people with developmental prosopagnosia have in daily life. And if you ask them to recognize, say, celebrities, so this is Renée Zellweger, very famous Hollywood movie star. If you ask them to recognize celebrities that you know are highly familiar to the vast majority of us, people with prosopagnosia will often tell you they don't know who this is. And when they do recognize them, because they do sometimes recognize people that are very familiar to them, even when they do recognize them, they're often doing it with a sort of weak level of confidence. So they might say, oh, I think this is, you know, the Bridget Jones actress, but I'm not 100% certain. Whereas the rest of us, when we're generally recognizing somebody like this and we recollect some details attached to them, we're quite confident that it is the person who we think it is. So these are some of the problems that people with prosopagnosia are suffering from. In some cases, it seems to run in families, suggesting that there might be a genetic component. But, you know, similarly, we find many cases that don't have any family history. So we're not really too sure what causes developmental prosopagnosia, if it is inherited, or if it is due to some sort of developmental disruption, whether it be in the womb or during birth or maybe during childhood development. We don't really know. But one of the key features is that it's generally lifelong, and it isn't attributed to any sort of head injury, which maybe could cause acquired prosopagnosia, that, you know, people have had a normal lifespan of intact face recognition abilities, and then suddenly they've had a brain injury, maybe after a stroke or a head injury in a car accident, that has then damaged regions of the brain that are thought to be important in face recognition, such as these core face regions like the fusiform face area and the occipital face area. When people suffer damage to these regions, you might quite often see them suffering from acquired prosopagnosia. But today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on developmental prosopagnosia, those cases that have lifelong problems. And when we look at neuroimaging papers that have been published on these cases, we do find some atypicalities in how they seem to be processing faces in these brain regions, and also in how these brain regions may be connecting with each other within the core face network, but also within extended face network areas such as the anterior temporal lobe, the amygdala, and the orbitofrontal cortex. Excuse me. Now, researchers like myself are often quite interested in what other aspects of cognition people with prosopagnosia might be having difficulties with. This is first to see what problems they're experiencing in daily life, but also to test models of visual perception. For example, is identity recognition processed through the same routes in the brain as what emotion recognition is? And I think it's certainly from my own research, it suggests that people with prosopagnosia may have some mild problems perceiving emotion, not so much that I think it would affect most of them day to day, but certainly when we use sort of psychophysics paradigms, we can detect some slight mild problems that they do in perceiving subtle differences. They also seem to have some problems in perceiving baby faces being cute. They may have very, very, very slight delays, only about 20 milliseconds per word delay when they're reading compared to neurotypical people on average, I should point out. They seem to have some problems with visual expertise for real world objects like cars. If you compare, for example, somebody who's a car expert with developmental prosopagnosia to a car expert that doesn't have prosopagnosia, you'll typically find the prosopagnosia case isn't performing as well on a visual recognition task. And it may also seem to have some subtle problems perceiving music.
May I ask a question ongoing?
Yeah.
May I ask a question ongoing? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Or in previous slide, when you're talking about emotion, do they see just open mouth? Is it emotion, or they just recognize that the mouth is open?
Okay, so if somebody's like angry or fearful, they may have an open mouth, right? Like if they're shouting at somebody. I do recall a reviewer saying this on one of our papers once. I don't think, at least in the developmental field, it's been tested. I can't recall. Maybe Mika could maybe recall better than what I can if it's been tested in acquired prosopagnosia. Yeah, it has.
Okay, sorry, I don't.
So I would have just said that, to my knowledge, as you said, Edwin, you require more subtle, fine-grained, like psychophysical paradigms to detect differences, because like in real life, so I think about it in your question is more targeted towards like what's the actual experience like on a day-to-day. I think the fact that we typically tend to oversee maybe sometimes is that these people aren't like black and white. It's not like they don't recognize anything or something or everything. It's like they're super efficient in using all different types of information, which means that they will rely on a lot of contextual information to aid whatever thing they have to do. Would you agree, Edwin?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say for developmental prosopagnosia, the vast majority of them will be able to tell you what's fear, what's sadness, what's anger, and so forth. But if you start morphing these emotions together so that they become a little bit more ambiguous, that's when you start to see some differences. I would say the main theory behind why they're having these problems is because they're not extracting as much information in general from the face. So when they're seeing a face's identity, maybe the face looks a bit more average looking. There isn't as much distinctive features being extracted from the face so that they can easily identify it the next time that they encounter it. And if this carries over into other aspects of facial information, such as emotion, then when facial emotion becomes a little bit more ambiguous, we might start to see people with prosopagnosia not extracting enough information to make sort of consistent judgments as to which emotion it might be when it's slightly ambiguous. Does that sort of answer the question? Whether or not it's specific to revealing teeth or having a mouth open, I couldn't say, and I don't think any of the papers really show that. I think people with prosopagnosia, there's a paper by Richard Cook's lab that I think shows that they have problems recently, with face masks. They're not recognizing emotion as well. They also have problems recognizing emotion from the eyes. Richard Cook and Federico Biotti published a paper about 6 years ago on that, actually.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. Is that okay? Okay, great. Now, that gives you a little bit of background to developmental prosopagnosia. Now, for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how we diagnose the condition. Now, this is a slightly simplified version of how we diagnose it. But typically speaking, we will advertise with posters around our local university. We'll put posters up in our local shops, supermarkets, and we may, do sort of interviews talking about prosopagnosia awareness with local newspapers and also with, local radio stations as well. And people with prosopagnosia will often not realize that this is even a condition. They've never heard of it before. It's not very well known compared to things like autism and dyslexia. But when they see this poster or hear this interview, suddenly all the problems that they've been having with faces throughout their whole life make sense, that they must have this condition. It's the only explanation for why, you know, they're not recognizing their boss, why they're not recognizing friends, because they can see everyone else around them recognizing faces really effortlessly, but they're obviously having these really severe problems. And so traditionally, I would invite them into the lab, where I'd go out and visit them in their homes, and we'd have a sort of semi-structured interview to confirm that they have had lifelong problems with faces. We'd confirm also that they don't have any history of serious head injury, that the prosopagnosia wasn't acquired later in life. We would maybe check for other sort of neurological conditions such as schizophrenia, which is associated with, or can be associated with, some problems in judging faces familiarity. And we will then ask them to sort of talk us through some examples of the problems that they experience sort of on a regular basis, but also the problems that specific examples of maybe where they've failed to recognize, say, like a boss or a family member, or maybe a neighbor, for example, that they know really well. And right now, with the way that prosopagnosia is diagnosed, it doesn't really matter what they tell us at the interview, as long as they just tell us that they're having problems recognizing faces. They could be telling us that they're not recognizing their daughter, like that case I was telling you, that was one of the first that I tested. That doesn't really matter unless they then perform poorly enough on a series of face processing tasks that, you know, are completed on a computer. Typically, I'd, you know, test them in the lab, but these days, with the advent of online testing and COVID, we have moved a lot of this stuff online. And the most common of these tests that are used to diagnose prosopagnosia is the Cambridge Face Memory Test. Now, this test, it only takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. It's a very widely used test. It's cited almost 1,000 times, the paper that it was originally presented in. And it consists of a study phase where participants will view a target face from multiple angles, and before then having to recognize it some several seconds later from a lineup containing 2 novel lures. And if you've been paying attention, you'll see that this face here is the target. And I reviewed all of the papers published in 2020 on developmental prosopagnosia and checked how many of them actually used the Cambridge Face Memory Test in some way to diagnose the condition. And what you can see here is that almost all of them did, 93% of them. The one exception to this is the Tian et al. Paper. And this came out of a Chinese prosopagnosia lab who had developed their own testing materials and diagnostic approaches. But typically speaking, if you are a prosopagnosia researcher in Europe or North America or in Australia, and you want to diagnose people with prosopagnosia, you will use the Cambridge Face Memory Test. That seems to be almost without question. But how do we use the Cambridge Face Memory Test to diagnose prosopagnosia? Well, to do this, we use something called the single case approach. And what this entails is basically testing a big sample of people who don't report any difficulties recognizing faces, so people who have neurotypical face recognition skills. We compute their mean on a test like the Cambridge Face Memory Test. We compute their standard deviation, and then we figure out a cutoff, which is 2 standard deviations below the neurotypical mean. And people that score below this, that are reporting troubles with faces, will be diagnosed with developmental prosopagnosia. And you can see here this sort of tail end of the neurotypical distribution. Now, if developmental, I should say that why we use this 2 standard deviation cutoff is because this is the 2-tailed threshold for detecting outliers, for detecting a statistically significant atypical score. Obviously, we're looking for people who have an impairment in this with respect to prosopagnosia, and it's this sort of this threshold where we use an absolute cutoff for determining atypicality. This is what is basically, in essence, a single case approach. Now, being a little bit more specific, I would say, you know, the 2-tailed threshold should be plus or minus 1.96 standard deviations, but it's commonly rounded up as 2 standard deviations below the control mean when diagnosing prosopagnosia. Although if you go and read a lot of these papers, they won't sort of clarify this. They won't tell you exactly why they're using 2 standard deviations as their cutoff. Now, if developmental prosopagnosia does just reflect the tail end of a neurotypical distribution, then we should see the highest incidence of cases just below this cutoff of 2 standard deviations below the control mean. And so I collected about 200 cases worth of data from all these papers published in 2020, and I plotted them like this to see what the distribution was, to see if they really do reflect something that would be akin to the tail end of the neurotypical distribution. And I think looking at this, highly skewed, left skew, that sort of fits in with the tail end of the neurotypical distribution. And this sort of supports the idea, I would say, that prosopagnosia is nothing more than the quantitative tail end of the sort of normally distributed set of the population scores. But there's a big problem with this. And the big problem is that roughly half of all cases who believe that they have developmental prosopagnosia, who will tell you, like the case that I was telling you earlier about, that doesn't recognize her daughter, half of them will not meet this criteria for a diagnosis. This single case approach will consider them as not having prosopagnosia. And it doesn't really matter what they've told you at the interview, that they're not recognizing their daughter, they're not recognizing their parents, they're not recognizing their boss in work. None of that matters if they don't meet this criteria. And I call these people excluded developmental prosopagnosia because when they fail to meet this criteria, they are generally excluded from taking part in any experiments that we are running. And so when you read the literature on developmental prosopagnosia and you look at the details in the papers, you won't often find cases that are scoring better than 2 standard deviations below a control mean. You might find some borderline cases sort of throughout the last 10 or 20 years that are included. More recently, a couple prosopagnosia labs have started liberalizing this cutoff. They're not using quite such a stringent 2 standard deviation cutoff. Some are using a sort of 1 standard deviation cutoff, because I think that other prosopagnosia researchers are realizing that we're excluding quite a lot of cases with the current sort of ultra conservative 2 standard deviation approach to diagnosing. Now, you may wonder to yourself, well, what are they like at interview compared to the people that do meet criteria? So I call the people that do meet the criteria on the Cambridge Face Memory Test classical DP. And this is because these are the classic cases that have been reported on historically in the literature. And I've sat in a room with countless numbers of classic DP cases and chatted with them about their symptoms and their experiences. And I've sat in a room with numerous excluded developmental prosopagnosia cases, talking about their symptoms and the sort of problems that they're experiencing in daily life and the sort of cues that they look for in a face to try to recognize it. And I can tell you, in my experience, there's nothing to distinguish between the 2 groups. It was always seemingly to me a complete lottery as to whether or not somebody would meet this criteria after talking to them on the Cambridge Face Memory Test versus those that didn't. I just couldn't predict who would meet criteria. And as I said earlier, that woman that was failing to recognize her daughter, she didn't actually meet the criteria. So I didn't include her in my research, and I don't think most prosopagnosia researchers would include her in their research because she didn't meet the criteria for impairment on a face recognition test. And so because of this, we don't really know what the distribution of developmental prosopagnosia will look like if we include these excluded cases. We also don't know what the prevalence will be if we include the excluded cases. It could be that developmental prosopagnosia may be something like this Gaussian distribution here on the left, with the classic cases plotted with the excluded cases. They may actually create this sort of single developmental prosopagnosia group. And it just so happens by chance that this group are impaired at a rough average level of 2 standard deviations below the neurotypical mean. And this means that half of the cases will never acquire a diagnosis simply because they don't score badly enough on this test, whereas the other half do acquire a diagnosis. And when I started writing this paper, I was thinking about it in terms of this threshold. If we consider all these people as having prosopagnosia, then this threshold of 2 standard deviations below the neurotypical mean, it just doesn't make sense to me to keep enforcing it. And around about that time, Robert McIntosh from the University of Edinburgh was presenting a talk actually to this lab that I attended. And he was talking about a paper that him and Jonathan Ritmo's PhD student had published in Cortex, basically outlining all of the issues that are apparent when using the single case approach from a pairs perspective, depending on the level of impairment at the group level of a neuropsychological group of patients or neurodevelopmental condition cases, this will dictate your test's power at diagnosing something like a neurocognitive disorder like developmental prosopagnosia. Now, if we accept that 50% of these cases, all of the excluded cases that is, actually do have prosopagnosia, then this means that the Cambridge Face Memory Test only has 50% power for diagnosing prosopagnosia. Now, if you were to run a test on neurotypical participants' face perception abilities, and you stated that you only had 50% power and then submitted that for publication somewhere, I don't think the response that you'd get from the editor would be terribly positive. Certainly if it ever made it to review again, it wouldn't be very positive. But yet, this is in essence what prosopagnosia researchers, and I include myself in this, have been doing when we exclude or use the Cambridge Face Memory Test in conjunction with the single case approach to diagnosing prosopagnosia. We're basically using what is a relatively low powered approach to diagnosing people. And this is the sort of take home message of the problem I see in the developmental prosopagnosia literature when it comes to diagnosing this condition. And I have talked a lot about the Cambridge Face Memory Test, but this is also apparent when we use pretty much any other face recognition task that you might think of that we want to, or face perception task that you might think of that we might use to diagnose this. I'm just focusing on the Cambridge Face Memory Test here because almost all labs are using it to diagnose prosopagnosia. And the cutoff that they're using of 2 standard deviations is one of the most common used by the labs. So really a lot of the labs are right now, excluding a very large proportion of people with developmental prosopagnosia from their research. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This was, I should say, Brad Duchesne in his paper where he published the Cambridge Face Memory Test, he showed a couple of cases that didn't meet criteria, and he said it's really important for us to not necessarily focus on this test as the sort of only method to diagnose the condition, but yet somehow throughout the whole prosopagnosia literature, it has become the key diagnostic approach to identifying people with prosopagnosia. And this paper here 30 years ago looked at a family of people that had developmental prosopagnosia, or at least they thought they did. And the researcher tested them on a series of sort of face processing measures. And one of the family members, despite saying that they weren't recognizing people on a regular basis in their life, they didn't meet the criteria, the extreme ultra-conservative, 2 standard deviation below a control mean to acquire a significant level of impairment. And in this paper, it was stated that this shows the importance of not trusting the participants' subjective experiences. But I would turn that around and say, I think it would be quite easy if, we had prosopagnosia that to actually tell that we have prosopagnosia. Imagine if you have a partner and you walk past them as though you don't recognize them. I mean, they'd probably give you quite the earful quite quickly, saying, what are you doing? But yet, even though this is your regular experience of failing to recognize people that you personally know, when you come into the lab and get tested and you don't meet this criteria on a certain cognitive task, suddenly you're told that you don't have prosopagnosia. I don't think that's a really counterintuitive way of diagnosing it, that we are sort of believing the cognitive task score is more indicative of their prosopagnosia than what their actual personal experiences in daily life are telling us. Now, that's the sort of problem with what I see diagnosing prosopagnosia right now in the literature. And there's a lot of implications for this, both in a scientific perspective, but also in a sort of more personal perspective for how it affects these people with prosopagnosia, the excluded cases, I should say. The first implication is that, when you sit down and you talk to the person, and you're looking at their Cambridge Face Memory Test scores, maybe their famous FACES test scores that diagnose them as having prosopagnosia, you'll be telling them, you know, based on your experiences, I think you sound like you have prosopagnosia, but to be included in our research, you haven't really met the criteria, and so we won't be inviting you back to participate in our future work. And you know, kind of straight away, they would often say, well, if I don't meet your criteria for having prosopagnosia, then what's wrong with me? Why can't I take part in your research? Why can't I recognize people that I personally know in daily life? And 10 years ago, when I started my PhD, the sort of sum total of what we could tell them is wrong with them was this: absolutely nothing. Beyond telling them that they don't meet the criteria for a diagnosis, there wasn't really anything to tell them, because researchers don't conduct any studies on these people. They don't systematically look at the sort of problems that they're experiencing in cognition, either with identity processing or in other areas of cognition like emotion or object recognition. Now, that was 10 years ago when I started my PhD. How do things look now? And I would say they haven't really changed. You can read the literature. I think there's certainly been a couple of papers published that have started to highlight that there's a lot of people that are being missed when it comes to acquiring a diagnosis. But I feel like there's still a little bit of maybe I don't know, maybe a lack of acceptance that they truly have prosopagnosia yet. I hope that's not the case, but I certainly get the feeling that there's maybe a little bit of convincing needing to be done so far to reassure researchers and clinicians that these people actually do have prosopagnosia. But because we never test them, we have therefore a complete absence of knowledge about them. So, you know, we have the neurotypical participants that obviously get a lot of attention when it comes to cognitive testing. We have the developmental and acquired cases that have a lot of interest invested in them with research. But we have this sort of grey population of excluded cases that are never reported on, or at least rarely reported on. We don't know anything about them really, what the difficulties they're having, why they're not meeting criteria on our cognitive tests. And I think this alone is a good enough reason to start testing them, to start reporting on them in our papers. Now, there are other implications. It's not just that we don't know anything about them that has got serious implications for our research. There's also serious implications for how we understand you know, a whole range of cognitive abilities. I've got some sort of mocked up data here of developmental cases, developmental prosopagnosia cases, both excluded and classical together here. So basically, these Z scores have been computed from a neurotypical mean and standard deviation. You can see here that as we've shown, or as I expect, sorry, prosopagnosia cases will be impaired roughly 2 standard deviations below the control mean when we include the classical cases. But let's say cognitive process 1 here on the y-axis, people with developmental prosopagnosia are perfectly intact when it comes to, you know, utilizing this process. So even though there's a correlation between the Cambridge Face Memory Test abilities and this cognitive process 1 abilities, maybe it's not due to whatever process is impaired when it comes to processing face in developmental prosopagnosia. Maybe this cognitive process is a sort of slightly more domain general process that is now being utilized by people with prosopagnosia to recognize faces. And that's why we're seeing this impairment here. We're seeing this relationship, but they're not impaired when they're you know, taking part in tasks that test this. But we are currently excluding, you know, these guys, the excluded cases who have grayed out here. And when we remove this top end of the prosopagnosia distribution, we'll then start to overestimate the effect sizes of impairments that we observe on the Cambridge Face Memory Test with respect to developmental prosopagnosia. And not only that, we will then start to see an impairment appearing artificially with respect to this cognitive process 1 here on the y-axis. So before the whole developmental prosopagnosia group were perfectly fine at completing this task, but now that we've removed the top half of the prosopagnosia distribution with the excluded cases, we're now saying that people with developmental prosopagnosia are impaired in this other cognitive process. But really, it's just an artifact of the fact that we're excluding a big chunk of the developmental prosopagnosia population. And this, in my view, undermines our trust in cognitive models and also neurocognitive models. So how is it that we can say that, say, emotion recognition and face recognition are truly dissociable or, similarly impaired by testing only the most extremely impaired developmental prosopagnosia cases? It could be that when we include the excluded cases, we actually find effect sizes of deficits becoming much smaller, or they may even disappear entirely. When we look at the neural data, we're saying these face processing regions are not functioning as they should be in people with developmental prosopagnosia. But if you're just removing the top half of performers from that developmental prosopagnosia group, then you're going to automatically assume these brain regions not working, when in actual fact they might be. And so, because we're excluding these developmental prosopagnosia cases from our research, this then impacts upon people who are developing these models of cognition and neurocognitive models as well, where they're trying to understand how certain processes are associated or dissociated. And I should say that, if you're thinking that the acquired prosopagnosia literature is immune to this and we can rely on that, I would say that's not true. One of the first acquired prosopagnosia cases I actually tested at the start of my PhD was a young man who, after a cocaine binge, had suffered a stroke, and upon recovering, he realized that he couldn't recognize faces anymore. And I remember very vividly, chatting to him. I can remember the actual room that I was in, chatting to him back in my department, and looking at his test scores, and I couldn't believe it, because he'd been telling me about how he couldn't recognize people personally known to him, but he could recognize within the neurotypical range on the Cambridge Face Memory Test and also the famous FACES test. So, it's not just the developmental prosopagnosia field this is affecting. It may be the acquired, well, it is the acquired cases as well. Now, the extent to which the acquired cases are being affected, I don't know, because I haven't tested enough of them. But it sort of makes us have to, rethink how much we can put weight on the past research on the most extremely impaired cases. Now, it seems, at least was maybe a little bit of a positive story here, that some people with developmental prosopagnosia can actually have their face recognition abilities rehabilitated to some extent. Just Dugutis's lab in America, and also Sarah Bay and Rachel Bennett's over here in the UK, they've developed face training paradigms that seem to help facilitate the development of face processing skills in some developmental prosopagnosia cases. But they're only ever testing the most severely impaired cases available. If we were to actually start including the full range of excluded cases who, on the Cambridge Face Memory Test, seem to have some residual face recognition abilities, or at least some sort of superior face recognition abilities, maybe because of their high-performing state, they may actually be better candidates for rehabilitation. But because we never test them, we don't know. And so we might actually be underestimating just how effective these treatments are for developmental prosopagnosia, because we're not including these people in our studies. Now, I would say that these three here are sort of scientific reasons to stop this exclusion of developmental prosopagnosia cases. And I would hope it's quite a compelling argument so far. And if it's not, then I would appeal to your sort of empathic human nature approach. And I will tell you right now that in my experience, being told that they can't take part in future research, that we're not really sure if they have prosopagnosia or not, is very upsetting to these people. I have, you could see the disappointment on their faces when you're sitting there chatting to them about how they don't quite meet this criteria, that we won't be using them for our research. But I do believe that they probably do have prosopagnosia. It's just that they don't have it with respect to how we might be able to get a paper published or whatever. Even trying to explain that in a very nice way, and I don't think it's very convincing listening to it there. You could see them being disappointed and feeling a little confused. I've spoken to many prosopagnosia cases who have been been excluded by other labs, and they've been very, very upset. They've felt a lot of anger about how the cognitive tests have basically left them in this sort of no man's land of diagnostic ambiguity, where they feel like they have prosopagnosia, but they can't really say to anyone, "Oh, I've been tested to sort of support this." And I feel like this isn't really something that prosopagnosia researchers ever, or clinicians, really consider when it comes to excluding these cases from our work, that it is having a negative impact on them. I think a lot of us are doing this research to learn more, to ultimately help these people, but inadvertently, we may be actually harming some of the people that our research is hopefully going to help. And I think with those sort of things in mind, I do raise a few other topics in my paper. I would hope that that would be convincing enough. I feel like it's convincing enough for me to stop excluding prosopagnosia cases. But I wanted to sort of add data to this to support this proposal. And so that's what I did with this paper. I decided to test a big batch of people that had excluded prosopagnosia to see if they're actually impaired on a lot of our neuropsychological tests or measures for face recognition and face processing, and particularly the diagnostic tests such as the Cambridge Face Memory Test and also the famous FACES test. We already know that they're not meeting the single case criteria for a diagnosis on a lot of these measures, but maybe if we pull together this group and do some group-based analysis, we might actually start to reveal impairments that are not revealed through the single case approach. And so, I did a pretty simple method of diagnosing people as either having prosopagnosia or not. I asked them, do you have trouble with faces? And a lot of people that, and I say trouble with faces, regular trouble with faces, where you're not recognizing people that you personally know, that you feel that you should be recognizing. We tested 48 people with neurotypical face recognition abilities. They said that they didn't have any trouble with faces in daily life. The ones that did say, responding to our posters around the university and posters in the local shops and email campaigns in the uni and so forth, the ones that did respond that they do have trouble with faces, that they feel that they have prosopagnosia, we then tested them with the Cambridge Face Memory Test. And this resulted in us finding 27 cases who had classic developmental prosopagnosia that actually met this 2 standard deviation impairment relative to a neurotypical mean, and 34 cases that scored better than this cutoff, that were basically the excluded group that would never really make it through to the papers that we're publishing, or at least not many of the papers that we're publishing. And I said way back that when I'm sitting there chatting to these people at an interview, they're indistinguishable from the cases that do meet criteria. But we know that they are performing better on the Cambridge Face Memory Test. So are there prosopagnosia symptoms, if we can quantify them, actually similar to the classic cases as what I feel like I see at the interview, or are they maybe a little bit milder? Maybe their prosopagnosia symptoms are not as severe, reflective of their superior abilities on the Cambridge Face Memory Test. And to assess this, I used a prosopagnosia index 20 questionnaire. Basically, it's 20 statements that have been developed based on the sorts of problems people with prosopagnosia tell us that they have. Like, they have a bad memory for faces, they mistake people that they have met before for strangers, and when people change their hairstyle or wear hats, they have difficulties recognizing them. Now, generally speaking, neurotypical people that don't report any problems with faces will generally be disagreeing through to maybe being slightly more ambiguous with a 3, but people with prosopagnosia will generally be on average rating above 3 on this questionnaire for each statement. And if we look at the neurotypical distribution, so 20 is the lowest score that you can get, and that's indicative of a complete absence of prosopagnosia symptoms. 100 is the max score that you can have, and that's obviously reflective of the most extreme level of presence of prosopagnosia symptoms. And we can see here that the neurotypical participants, I plot just the histograms through it just to give you a sense of the distribution. We can see here that the neurotypical participants, the vast majority of them are sort of saying that they don't really have problems with faces, they don't have any prosopagnosia symptoms. There are a few cases here that are sort of straying into the slightly ambiguous territory. And when we look at the classical developmental prosopagnosia cases, we find that they are reporting many multiples of standard deviations beyond this sort of neurotypical mean. The prosopagnosia index, if we were to use this single case approach here, would categorize all of these people as highly abnormal. in respect to their symptoms that they're reporting on this questionnaire. So what about the excluded developmental prosopagnosia cases? Well, when we actually looked at their distribution of scores, we find that there's no difference really between them and the classical cases. Very much like what I experienced at the interview, where I couldn't distinguish between who was going to turn out as having prosopagnosia according to the CFMT cutoff versus those that didn't. They seem indistinguishable when it comes to the symptoms. And so they certainly aren't exhibiting milder symptoms than the classic cases. So maybe there is, it seems that together they seem to be all having the same sorts of problems, at least when we look at the sort of average scores. So if they are having such severe difficulties in daily life, then why are we excluding them from our research? Like I said, I wanted to test further, though, to see, are they exhibiting what we could call objective impairment on a FACES test, a cognitive test, such as the Cambridge Face Memory Test, when we analyze them as a group. This is the Cambridge Face Memory Test scores on the x-axis. So there's 72 trials in this test, and so scores up here at 72 are indicative of sort of perfect performance. Getting down here about 28 is where people just can't really discriminate faces correctly at all. And you can see here the classic cases are exhibiting this left skewed distribution, like what we saw when I plotted all of the cases from 2020. And when we add in the excluded cases, it seems to form this single prosopagnosia group. And that when we're using this sort of cutoff of 2 standard deviations below the neurotypical mean, which is actually fewer than 43 trials correct, we're actually excluding the top half of this distribution. And I think it's quite remarkable that how well this sort of tallies up with the hypothesis that using the single case approach in tandem with the CFMT scores is actually excluding just the top half of the prosopagnosia distribution. So yes, they are impaired on the Cambridge Face Memory Test when we do group-based analyses to increase power. I wanted to also assess whether or not they have problems recognizing familiar faces. And to do this, I got them to complete a famous faces test where they had to just identify, very big name celebrities such as, I can't remember now, the Queen and Prince Harry, I think maybe. What we find is that the neurotypical participants are scoring fairly well on this test. The classic DP cases that are impaired on the CFMT are scoring quite poorly at the group level. And then we have the excluded cases who are, again, scoring quite poorly relative to the neurotypicals. So it seems that on 2 of the main diagnostic tests that a lot of labs are using, the famous FACES test and the Cambridge Face Memory Test, excluded cases do exhibit objective impairments that are roughly about, if I remember correctly, about 1 standard deviation below the neurotypical mean. Now, if you look at other sort of neurodevelopmental or neuropsychological conditions, an impairment of 1 standard deviation would be considered, quite a big impairment. But traditionally speaking, this hasn't really been sufficient to get a diagnosis at the individual case level. So, what are the solutions to these issues in the prosopagnosia field? I hope that the theory behind why we should stop excluding these cases has been compelling. If it's not been, then I hope the data at least has been compelling. And so what would I recommend as a solution to these excluded cases? Well, I would say that every time that we're publishing papers now, I realize a lot of us have written papers that we just are looking to publish, and I don't have a problem with that you're not going to go away and test a whole bunch of excluded cases. There will obviously be a lag between when we recommend that we start including excluded cases in our work versus when that will actually happen. But we do recommend that we should start testing excluded cases, if for nothing else, to actually learn what is maybe different or what is actually similar to them to the classic cases. We recommend that the prosopagnosia index questionnaire should be used as the main tool to diagnose prosopagnosia. This actually identified, using the single case approach, everyone in both the excluded and the classical prosopagnosia groups as being abnormal in respect to their symptoms. So I think we should move away from the cognitive task-based approaches to diagnosing, because we're just simply missing too many cases using that as a method. one of the reviewers said to us actually for our paper that some clinicians and researchers will never accept a questionnaire as an approach to diagnose what is essentially a neurocognitive disorder, which is characterized, by a deficit in a specific area of cognition. If some people aren't convinced by this using the PI-20, then, well, obviously we're going to have to look at some new diagnostic tests. I personally will be using the PI-20 to diagnose prosopagnosia going forward in tandem with self-reported regular problems in daily life, in the absence of, sort of exclusionary conditions such as schizophrenia. But I'm also, kind of curious, can we actually find any test that actually can demonstrate at the single case level all prosopagnosia cases as being atypical relative to a neurotypical sample? And I must admit, I don't know if that will happen anytime soon. But it would be interesting to see if we could figure out more about what the problems are that these excluded cases are experiencing, that they're currently been missed, at least at the single case approach. And finally, we need to sort of embark on a series of studies that reassess the literature with the excluded cases included. Like I said, most of the literature out there excludes over 50% of these developmental prosopagnosia cases. So to sort of understand what the effect size of impairment or lack of will look like now with these cases included, will require quite a lot of sort of replication efforts. And I think hopefully that has convinced you that we should change the approach to diagnosing prosopagnosia so that we're actually including these excluded cases in future. I'd obviously like to thank some of the researchers that are my co-authors on the paper who helped me collect many of these prosopagnosia cases, and also prosopagnosia cases who made this work possible. And if you know anyone that's interested in doing a PhD with me in this area of prosopagnosia, please tell them to get in touch. We have PhD places available at my university with a closing date of 9th of January. And if you want to see the paper, you can go there on behavior research methods to read more. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edwin. I hope that you can still hear me. I had a slight audio glitch earlier. First of all, I'm just going to stop the recording right now so that we can engage in the discussion.